Say good morning. My name is Randy Zucker from the JCC. Thank you for being with us. Please note that we are recording this morning's program, so we'll be keeping everyone on mute so that there will not be ambient noise during recording. We'll be sending out the recording to all those who registered and weren't able to join us live this morning. For all of you joining us live, thank you and welcome. I'm so happy that you're here, and I'm so happy to introduce our esteemed in-house moderator, Miss Lisa Bleish, who will be leading our program and conversation today with author Jennifer Rosner. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Randy. Hi, everybody. As Randy said, my name is Lisa Fleisch, and I am not only the chair of the One Book, One Jewish Community Book Read, I also have the distinct pleasure of being JCC's in-house author moderator, a title I wear very proudly. We want to give a warm welcome to our partners and sponsors of the event, the Holocaust Resource Center of Kean University and the Arbor Terrace Mountainside. Thank you for your support. We really appreciate it. Before we get started, I just want to say it's really hard to get excited about anything bookish or social this week when many people are experiencing unimaginable pain, many of us in this audience as well. Here at the JCC, we're absolutely devastated by the attacks on Israel and everything that has transpired since. Our hearts are broken, but we forge ahead because books have the power to connect, to engage, to educate, to transport, and ultimately to heal. And with that said, I'd like to welcome back this morning our speaker, Jennifer Rosner. In the spring of 2020, we had the pleasure of virtually hosting Jennifer when she spoke about her phenomenal book and National Jewish Book Award finalist, The Yellow Bird Sings. And now we are thrilled to welcome her back to talk about her newest novel, Once We Were Home. She will do a better job talking about her book than I will, but I will tell you that I was really riveted by the true stories of the children stolen in the wake of World War II and during World War II. In addition to her two novels, Jennifer has previously published a memoir, If a Tree Falls, about raising her deaf daughters in a hearing-speaking world and discovering genetic deafness in her own family dating back to the 1800s. In both the novel and the memoir, she explores themes of silence and sound, loneliness and connection. Her short writings have appeared in the New York Times, the Massachusetts Review, the Forward, and elsewhere. In addition to writing, if that wasn't enough, she also teaches philosophy. She received her BA from Columbia University and her PhD from Stanford. She has taught at Stanford and at Mount Holyoke College. She currently teaches the Clementi course in humanities, a college-level course for women living in economic distress. She lives in Western Massachusetts with her family, and we are so grateful this morning that Jennifer is with us to speak about her experiences writing these books. And I would like to welcome Jennifer.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here, despite the sadness of this moment. Yeah, and maybe it will be a bomb to try to talk about this novel, which really does deal with children in wartime and and adults in wartime, and probably will have reverberations for many of the people who are experiencing the horrors in Israel right now. So maybe we're going to have this conversation, but just before the beginning of the show, we decided I might just give a short presentation of the inspirations and some of the research I've done and launch in. So
awesome, and also a synopsis of what the book is about, because not everyone has read it, so that would be super helpful.
Yeah. So this novel, Once We Were Home, is the weaving together of the fictional stories of four children who are, I mean, in essence, moved from a place of home in the wake of World War II. So there's a brother and sister pair, Oscar and Anna, who are living with a Polish farm family during the Holocaust when a person comes and tries to take them back, returning them to Judaism. And that's one storyline. And then Roger is a boy who's been harbored by the church. And when his relatives come to try to claim him, some aunts, the church actually steals him over the Pyrenees to try to save his Catholic soul. And then Renata is a child who believes her German parents are her own, and her story evolves to kind of explore some of the themes of Germanization during World War II. And decades later, these characters, all their stories converge in unexpected ways in Israel. And, overarchingly, I guess it's about, children who are taken from a place of home, who are moved in accordance with the mission of adults, ideologies in many ways, and their struggles with a sense of identity and belonging and home. And also, I should say, there's one other little thread in the novel that is narrated by a little Matryoshka doll.
Yes.
And we can get into that more later, but I thought it was really important to explore the issues of memory and in childhood trauma. And Renata, my character, who was moved from home very young, doesn't remember what was happening to her, but she was carrying her little doll with her, and the doll becomes sort of the narrator for her backstory and a witness to what she went through.
I have to say, I had to go back because I was reading that part in the book, and I was confused. I'm like, who is this talking? And then at the end, I went back and I read it, and I read all the excerpts again, and I was like, oh, okay, now I get it. Now I understand where that is. So it's good to know
Yeah.
that going forward. So as you're reading it, you'll know what that is referring to. So thank you for clarifying.
Yeah. And so, what gets a novelist to their desk every single day, right? I met a woman while I was doing interviewing of Holocaust survivors for the Yellowbird Sings. I was interviewing a man who told me, you should interview my wife because her story's more interesting than mine. And I ended up sitting down with this Holocaust survivor who told me that just after the war, she worked as an operative for what they call the redemption of Jewish children, where they would well, in her case, she survived the Holocaust in a Siberian labor camp. She returned to her native Poland, where just something like 3% of Jewish children had survived, and mostly in Christian settings. And this mission came out to try to retrieve those Jewish children, and it made complete sense after all the annihilation and devastation to try to get back every Jewish child. But as she was talking, I was really thinking about the children themselves and the ruptures they experienced. So first, their own family, was broken apart. They were put maybe into like a Christian home, a farm family, maybe, or a convent. And then, they were trying to make their way in that setting. And then after the war, they were being taken again because they wanted to be back with Jews. So like what it was like for those children in particular, I was really interested in that question. And I guess the really personal part of this is that I had an experience as the parent of deaf children. My husband and I are both hearing parents. Our children are both deaf. And when they were very little, people had these opinions about where and with whom they belonged. They should be raised by deaf people. They should be raised, but in this way or that way, in signing and speech. And, they had all these views about where a child belongs and who should raise that child and how they should live. And there was something about the ways in which people were moving children around, like they should be Christian, they should be Jewish, they should be, that just kind of hit this personal nerve. Not that there's really an equivalency there, but just I think that psychologically, I was working on things too, about our own experience. So I just think for me as a writer, that happens. I'm working some stuff out, mother-daughter relationship in Yellowbird Sings, it's there's like these personal tentacles that go pretty deep. And then I write this completely fictionalized story about a part of history that, is entirely different, but somehow reaches into my own stuff. So, in terms of that movement, so there's like really in a way, there's like three historical parts to my story because of the different kinds of cases of children being moved that I look at. But in the case of Jewish children being reclaimed, or as we'll talk later, there's sort of a lot of linguistic confusion or argument about what it really was. Some people called it, redeeming, some said reclaiming, some said ransoming. There were all these different words. And I think it was really telling as you look at more. And, one thing to say too is that, how it was experienced by the children who were moved depended a lot on the age of the child and what they remembered of their Jewish roots or what relationships they had with their Christian family or the convent, et cetera. So there was so much complexity to the cases. And and so I think that, I go into that, and I purposely chose a sibling pair of different ages to show that, one child might respond to this kind of movement in one way, and another child would respond in a completely different way. It was very individual. And,
Right. And it was
and
also interesting how how in each one of those cases, because with Anna and Oscar, he was the one who was very comfortable, whereas she remembered it. But there was also this a little bit of a sense of shame, not a little bit, but a lot of a sense of shame that was sort of imposed on the children, even though they were in loving environments. It was an idea that they should be ashamed of where they came from. Don't say you're Jewish, don't say you're this.
I mean, I
It was,
don't, it wasn't only shame, it was danger. So
yeah,
during the war, they could not say they were Jewish. They had to hide their, their Yiddish language. They had to, and so I think that that complexity too for children of war, where your identity could get you killed, right? Or
yeah,
it could get this whole family killed. It was this terrible pressure. And when, there were children who after the war were terrified to learn that they were Jewish. They were terrified
yeah,
to admit that they were Jewish. It was dangerous to be Jewish. It is
yeah,
dangerous to be Jewish. And and very complicated. And so for sense of identity, and like it's true that maybe the survivors, the Holocaust survivors who are trying to return those children to Judaism, were doing so many things. They were trying to honor the wishes of these parents who had died in the Holocaust. They were trying to bring pride back to Judaism, and that you shouldn't be ashamed of Judaism. They were trying to rebuild a collective. They were trying,
right,
there were so many different things they were
right,
doing. But they were also fighting against this sort of historical backdrop. And it is true too that in some of those Christian situations, there was just basic anti-Semitism, which some of the children
right.
just kind of imbibed. And so the whole thing was incredibly complex. Um, I wanted to say just that, as I'm going to show some pictures soon, but that the cases are very different. Like I have these, different sets of children who are moved, and eventually their stories come together. But at first, you're just learning about these situations. So,
Right.
one is this Jewish, sibling pair in a farm family, and then there's this boy who's in a convent,
Right.
and then there's this girl whose history is really a mystery to her, etc.
Yeah.
And I wanted to say, like, it's really important to me that, there's no equivalency made between these kinds of cases. It's just that children who are moved, children of war who are struggling with these things, there's something common about them because their sense of identity is thrown into total confusion, their sense of placement and belonging. So they do share something, even if the situation is completely different, because the church taking a child on the run to protect them, and
Oh,
church
yeah,
not wanting them to go back to Judaism is a completely different thing than Jewish people trying to reclaim Jewish children, or Germans trying to Germanize children, even if in their minds they believe that it would be better for Poles to be German than to be Poles. They might actually believe that they're doing the right thing by the child. Righteousness is a funny thing. You believe, you can be a believer, and it may not be a legit belief, but you believe it, right? And
right.
so there's all these adults who are believing things and doing things for children, and then meanwhile the children are just being, moved and trying to catch up and try to figure out who they are and how are they supposed to live after this. Um, so
And
that's
it was
kind of,
also,
yeah.
oh, go ahead. I was just
No,
say, as a
please.
reader, it was interesting just because when you're reading the different characters and there's sort of, you bring up a lot of these ethical decisions, like who, like, I think it was like on page 98, Roger says, who owns the soul, to who does the soul belong to? So it's kind of like everyone, as you say, the adults all think that they're doing the right thing. There is some question. And even as a reader, when you're looking at these different situations, you're wondering, oh, well, in this situation, maybe that's a good thing. But in this situation, it seems like maybe that's not such a good thing. So it's not a real clear-cut answer in terms of what's right when you really think about what's best for the child versus what's
Yeah.
best for the community that they think they're trying to build.
And I really wanted to, I guess, expose the moral ambiguities, and
Mhm.
and to say that, for instance, in the case of the Jewish survivors who are trying to reclaim Jewish children, there
Yeah,
was this range of attitude. The woman I interviewed believed really certainly that she had saved those children, that she was doing the right thing. She saved Judaism. She was saving the children. I mean, she was doing the right thing. Other operatives when you read their testimony, are really, in retrospect, somewhat ambivalent and not sure that taking children from these settings, especially the ones where they were well bonded, was really right psychologically for those children. And many of these operatives followed the children they had removed over their lifetimes. And
Mhm.
some admitted, like, this caused psychic damage and I probably shouldn't have done it. And when you come to sort of the numbers, you're like, it doesn't have to happen for every child. If the child is in a certain setting, should we leave it? But at the time, right after the war, after all the devastation, no one talked that way. They weren't wondering, well, how well bonded are they and how whatever. They were like, they're Jews and they belong back with the Jews. That's it. It was very it was a bit crude in the same way where, you know, but it was a
Yeah.
survival instinct, and it was, you know, it was a lot of things, you know, from a psychological standpoint. But I did want to raise that, you know, that they were really later questioning if this was right for every child. And in general, I think it's really worth questioning when we move children around. And the thing about this thing about child movements is it's just been happening forever, and it's happening everywhere, right? Like so
It's still
in Chile,
happening.
in
Yeah.
Yemen, in, you know, in Canada, I mean, there's just case after case, different types of historical cases of children for some reason being taken from, you know, and moved to some other setting, and a belief that, I don't know, they're doing it right, but it can be quite damaging. Um,
Yeah.
hang on, I'm so sorry, it's so awkward, but I'm freezing cold in my office. I'm
Yeah,
I'm
sure. No
just gonna
problem.
wrap myself
Well,
up
well,
here. I'm sorry. I happen to have this very cozy thing on me, so that's a bit funny, but that's a first for me. But anyway, I could show you some photos that like
yeah,
undergird the
that'd be
kind
great.
of some of this research I did for each of the storylines. And let me, you guys will be patient while I figure out my screen share. Okay. So this photo to the left is a picture of, courtesy of Yad Vashem Photo Archives, is a picture of a young operative who's moving children, you know, having taken them from settings that were Christian and moving them into either children's homes in Poland. And then I followed, having worked with a historian about the specific route that children were moved along, you know, from, you know, sort of children's home to children's home in Poland, in Bavaria, in Marseille, France, and then finally on a boat to Palestine. So it's really kind of grounded in a lot of historical research of specific movements of children by particular operatives who were interviewed, and sort of the complexity of you know, all the decision making they were doing. In
Mhm.
the Roger case, I'll run through these sort of quickly. Roger, my boy Roger, who is you know, who was hidden in a convent and then moved over the Pyrenees to try to be a, you know, they didn't want to return him, is loosely based but entirely fictionalized on the Finley affair, which was a case of these two brothers, Robert and Gerald Finley, who had been, you know, hidden for safekeeping in a convent, who an aunt, actually, whose last name was Rosner, weirdly enough, was trying to get these children back. And there was a custody battle, honestly, where the church did not want to give them back, and the courts were ordering it. And you know, nuns and priests went to jail, and they just did not want to return them to Judaism. And basically, there's when the archives opened, a scholar from Brown, David Kurtzer, actually was like there to read these stories. It showed that, you know, the order to not return the kids to Judaism, and to this aunt in particular, went all the way so high up in the papal order. You can't believe it. I mean, it was like
Yeah.
yeah. So there was just a big thrust to not give them back. These pictures are just some parts of like the cases of children who were Germanized. So Renata was taken from a family in Poland. She was taken into, you know, measured in something like 86 places to make sure her eyes chart would, you know, match, and the caliper test and all these different things, so that she could be, you know, racially pure enough to be in a Germanized family, in a German family. Later, I was reading the accounts of this UNRRA worker, Gita Sereny, who was charged after the war to try to get those children to be repatriated back to their Polish families. And again, what you see is so much rupture of these children. Like, she got, Renata in my, fictionalized case, was bonded in many ways to this new life. And then, you get pulled back. So it's just very complicated. This little photo is just to see some of the images that I was thinking about working with while writing the novel. I find that even children who are going through these crazy periods, even in war, still will play with their spinning top on the floor, and they will, find the feather on the walk in the forest, and they will play with their Matryoshka dolls. And it was really important because that's the day-to-day life, even while giant and very difficult things are happening. And that's just something my publicist would love me to have. So let me stop.
All of your books, yes. I understand why instead of the two brothers, you had Roger, and then it was the boy that was deaf, that was mute, that wasn't talking. So you kind of interspersed your that experience in, which was also really interesting.
Yeah, I've stopped sharing, right? I'm good. I'm back.
We're
back.
You stopped
Okay,
sharing,
great.
so you're good.
Thank you.
One thing I should just mention is anyone who has a question, please put it in the chat, and then when we'll get to the end of the Q&A or in the middle, if there's something, I'll go ahead and ask those questions as well. So I'm wondering, how much research did you on the children who were hidden and kept in the church during the war and the aftermath? How much of that was true? I mean, you said that there was that whole case. How many kids were kept that way, and how many were either returned, and how many souls were still saved?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, what I should say is, so there were various cases, and let me just show you a few things that are helpful. I mean, there's this book by an Israeli historian named Emuna Nachmani Gafni, who wrote this book called Dividing Hearts. And in the case of her research, I mean, she really unbelievably was able to talk to almost like every operative who did this work. Maybe not every single one, but nearly everyone. And so many of the children who were taken and I mean, there's this big controversy about like the number of children who ended up being retrieved. Some say it's like in the vicinity of 600, so not like a gigantic number. But it was also, a whole process. Like, how do you find the children where they're hidden, right? Because first of all, so much went into disguising, right? So like you would never, like even when like Irena Sendler, it's true, who worked for Jagoda, she would, there were stories of how she would put a child's name, their Jewish name, and then their like a sort of Christianized name in jars in her garden and bury them. But it was so dangerous. If anyone ever found, if Nazis found those jars, it would have been a complete disaster, right? So you're trying to hide someone's identity, and then later you're trying to locate their identity, right? You're trying to find them after the war so you can get them back, or so they can find their family or whatever. So there's this crazy thing where, initially you're trying to like hide every track, and then after they were charged with trying to find them. And there were different methods, and there was like a Jewish committee in Poland. They were trying to locate them, and then they had to negotiate, and often they were, there was some funding, and they were trying to get money, and for these very poor farm families who had been giving some of their food to this child, and they were trying to care for an extra child. Sometimes it was really hard for them to say no to this chunk of money and let the child come back, leave and go back. And others, I mean, they just refused to do it, even though they really, really could use the money. But one thing that was interesting was over the history of this effort to try to reclaim Jewish children, the amount of money demanded got higher and higher. So they were starting to pay more and more over time. So there were so many factors. And then there was like the church part, them like sort of within a convent or a church. So there were like sort of individual families hiding Jewish children, very, some cases very righteous and very loving, other cases needing an extra farmhand, doing it because they'd get the wedding ring. There was just such a big variety of motivation and tone in terms of the family situation. And then in the church, you know, there were also very righteous nuns who were trying to tell those children, you know, we're going to go through these motions in church, but you're a Jewish child. You know, they were trying, except when it wasn't safe enough to reveal or to let the child remember. I mean, there was so much complexity there too. And then there were the people who just like were trying to convert the child, get a child into
Yeah.
Christianity. I mean, there was
Right,
just
like
this
Madame
giant,
Mercier, yeah.
yeah, there's just a range in every setting. There are really, I mean, this is humanity, right? And in every group and in every circumstance, is goodness, and there's less goodness, and there's evil,
Yeah.
and so you see the gamut of it, you know, and
Yeah, and I
yeah,
think you did a good job of showing all of those different areas, because you had Oscar and Anna who were very well loved by their family and felt very comfortable and felt very safe. And like for Oscar, it was the only family that he knew. I mean, Anna remembered more, and Roger had the, you know, some of the characters, some of the clergy and the nuns were also, like you said, trying to, I don't know that they necessarily told me he was Jewish, but they were not trying to fight for his soul. Whereas Madame Mercier was like, you know, baptizes him after he's being supposed to be taken away. So there was very much this conflict. Maybe that's I guess that's the philosopher in you, is that you bring in all of this moral ambiguity, which I really appreciated, because there were no right answers. And as you said, everyone had different ways that they approached it, and that's confusing for for the kids. And I think Roger, who becomes a philosopher, right, so you used a lot of his questioning of, you know, what is my identity and how do I find that. I'm
yeah.
wondering, there's so many displaced children still today, as you mentioned, you know, just, you know, throughout it. Can you talk a little bit about the long-term impact you found on children who were separated from their families at an early age, even when they were well loved, and kind of that generational trauma and how that gets passed down?
Yeah. I mean, I'll tell you that I saw a lot of this really firsthand in interviewing hidden children for the Yellowbird Sings,
Hmm.
where, you know, especially for the children who were separated from their parents and ended up in these other situations, right? I mean, there were survivors who were hidden with their mom or in a barn or whatever and stayed with their mom in the barn, and that's really different than being separated. And
Yeah.
I just found what I found is that this pain just never goes away. Like I was interviewing people who are in their 70s and 80s. And, you know, you'd walk into someone's house and you see that they made this life for themselves where they're showing you the bar mitzvah pictures of their grandchildren. And it's this beautiful, you know, loving situation. And then, you know, when you get down into the conversation of their past, there's like a if they're willing to do it, and the ones I talked to there were some people who, even in my own town, there were some Holocaust survivors who just were like, look, I can't talk about it. I mean, you know, I had to fly to Florida or drive here to go to get someone to interview, when some people in my own town, but they were just like, look, I can't. I'm willing to tell a script to high school students. I know what I'm going to say, but I can't sit and have tea with you. Like I can't have it meander and go somewhere. It's just too hard. But for the ones who really opened up, you know, what I really saw was just how it was so traumatic. That there was this one man who told me that, you know, after a long hopefulness that, you know, his parents were alive, and then finding out that they weren't alive, but they had been told that they were, and that for that reason he went on this particular like journey to go, like it was just like everyone was trying everything to get children to be safe. He basically said to me, like, if you told me my mom was in my kitchen, I wouldn't go in there. Like he just couldn't.
You can.
He was so it was so painful, and he had been dealing with it for so long and trying to, you know, cope. And there was just this pain. And like I said, he was probably in his early 80s and still
Mhm.
enduring this terrible pain. And I remember this other woman who was all similarly aged, who had a very different view, and it was also startling to hear, because she said, you know, we never actually saw my father's body. Like she was with her mom. Her dad had been reputed to be killed in the street in Poland. And she said, but I never saw him dead. You know, I never saw his body. And so he may still be alive. And
Yeah,
she
the hope.
looked at me and said that right now. And like, I mean, you're there and you're like, okay, but you know, he'd be 100 and, you know,
Yeah, right,
he'd be
right,
150, you know, or whatever. But that kind of hopeful, that child's hopefulness. Like you realize how vulnerable we are and how, it stays that way. Like it didn't change. I was really struck by the difficulty people went through, and sort of, even if they moved forward and made a life, there was challenges to connectivity. There were challenges to forging, hopeful new relationships, right? Because there was just this terrible pain. And I mean, we do know about epigenetic research and about how it kind of has traveled in generations, and I think that's why what's happening in Israel right now feels like cellularly. I mean, it's so hard to read, but there's a lot of news in the world that's hard to read, but this news kind of hits like,
Yeah.
in our bodies in this particular way, and that is inherited trauma, right? And
Yeah.
cellularly so, and um, yeah, it is just very hard. And then on the other hand, there was a man I interviewed who, he said, he was in a school attic with his mother during the Holocaust, and his mother, actually taught him to read in the attic, and she had an atlas, and she was, like quizzing him about, if you had to get from Odessa to Warsaw, what route would you take? I mean, she was like with her son in this particular way in this hidden attic where children were playing on the outside, and he was silent inside. And he described his time with his mom as cocooned in love, which is an unbelievable testimony to a mother who's hiding a child during the Holocaust in a school attic when, other, Christian kids are outside in the yard. And I mean, there was just every scenario you could imagine, and every emotional valence you could imagine. And yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. My grandmother-in-law, so my husband's grandmother was before the Holocaust, but she was sent. She was born in Paris but lived in Poland, and was sent when she was about 7 years old because they didn't have enough money for a dowry. I think that was the reason that she was told, and she was sent to New York to live with her uncle, and she never saw her family again. And I think they all died in the Holocaust. And it was always just this, she just always felt alone. I mean, she was a very positive person, but there was always that sense of like that she wasn't wanted, which was never left her. She lived till into her 90s, and
Yeah.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a
I
tough
was
thing.
going to say, you think about all the cases that have been on our minds, children at the border, separated
Mhm.
from their parents. And like when I hear about all of these different stories, I just think to myself about those people when they're 80, like, because these are the people I spoke to, and it didn't matter.
Yeah,
They were 5 at the time. These things are going to be with them. All these things
yeah,
are going to be with them.
yeah, absolutely. So, much of the book takes place in the early days of Zionism, and building Israel post World War II, when it was first founding. Of course, it's heartbreaking what's going on. And I'm just wondering, how do you reconcile the Israel you wrote about, which held such promise, to what's happening today?
Yeah. Um, I mean, it's interesting because there was such promise and hopefulness, and I hope there will be, we will find our way
Yeah.
to healing and peace. But I also guess it's really important to think that, it was built by people who had survived the Holocaust, right? I mean, and who had gone through so many traumas already. And I thought that was really interesting. And one thing I did on purpose, the way my characters meet up in certain ways is quiet and subtle. Someone
Mhm.
shows up in a store and wants to buy the chessboard or the
Yeah.
the nesting boxes, and the other, the person there is, they've both had an experience of being moved as children, in some sense being stolen back or stolen from, whatever, they've undergone a shared experience.
Yeah.
And yet they never talk about it, right? They just sell the box and wrap it up. Do you want me to for the plane or not? And I purposely did it that way because I feel like that's Israel, where so many of the people, they do have these experiences. They share these experiences. It's just the undergirding of the nation. You know,
Mhm.
you don't actually say like I wasn't going to have my, I wasn't going to have my characters meet at the, stolen children conference of
Yeah,
19,
right. The
like
support group,
whatever.
right?
You know what I mean? Like the actual
Yeah.
truth of the people of Israel is that many of them were
Worse.
survivors of these situations and traumas,
Yeah.
and they were building a nation and, brought many things with them, in terms of ingenuity and, um, and resilience, and also the trauma and all these different things. So I
Yeah.
wanted that complex picture of Israel, of us knowing that this is the way Israel was founded. You know what I mean? This
Right.
is who, these were the beginnings. And so it's just unbelievable to me that we're standing here now where
Mhm.
there was this big terrorist attack that many people are describing as like pogrom like, whatever, very so,
Yeah.
um so reverberatory, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
To the Holocaust. So um I don't know. I mean, I all I can say is I just hope we can move as quickly as possible out of this completely horrific moment.
Yeah, exactly. Well, do you feel, when you're writing this book, you were exploring something that happened 75 years ago and post. How do you think about now, like how much more relevance this book still has today? Why it's so important? This is Holocaust remembrance. Tell
Yeah.
us why you like it in viscerally and just importantly, this type of novel is
Yeah.
to everyone, really.
Yeah. I mean, I want to say that the history that's in this novel is history I hadn't learned about, hadn't known about. It was all history that surprised me. And
Hmm.
I feel like I've heard that from readers too. Like I didn't know about this, these particular movements of children. And I guess it meant a lot to me to, I don't know, to find the stories of the Holocaust that haven't been told and
Yeah,
to share those stories. And I have to say too, like I am really interested in like sort of all the different complexities of this story. And when you look at it though, sometimes you might think like, when the Jewish in terms of the Jewish operatives retrieving children back to Judaism, right? There are people who call that, a stealing of sort or something, like they were in one setting and they were taken back. And one thing that I've been really interested in is vocabulary and how things are talked about. And coming to it with complete humility, because until you're in a particular historical moment, I don't think you can really understand that. And actually, I want to say that this is related to something else really relevant. I mean, in the case of my novel, what words for a child who's lost their parents, who are hidden with this other family? They have no parents, they don't have papers, they are
mhm,
just there, this family's offering to care, but then this other group says, but they belong to us. What are the words for what that scenario is? I don't know. Is it saving, as the one person I interviewed called it? Is it stealing, as other operatives have called it? What is it? I don't even know what to call it, you know what I mean? And
mhm.
but I also think that, when one isn't in a complex situation themselves, the understanding of it is really usually flawed. And I think that the Israeli-Palestinian situation and, generally standing around in America having judgments about
Yeah,
these situations is a really fraught thing. And, when you're not in it and you're not sort of really living it, it's very hard to know what's happening. It's
yeah,
really it's really really hard. And sometimes like I'll talk to Israelis who say like, I mean, like our understanding is so crude. We get it through like these news channels. We get it
yeah,
through sort of all these different filters and slants and whatever. And it's just really hard to make sense of a life that, is distant in some ways from yours. And I think that's why, like in the development of my characters, it is so blurry and like each of these children is grappling with
yeah,
so many things that you could have glossed over as a writer. You really could have. You could have made it like that they're so happy to be back, and it was like a return, of
right.
uh, and I think a lot of people do actually want to see it that way for psychological reasons. You want to be like, it was great to get back to the kibbutz, where kibbutzes are kibbutzim are complicated places, right? And they've been shown, by many, with respect to going from, you're not actually only, sort of with your core, your
Yeah.
nuclear family, but you're in this sort of community family and what that is psychologically, et cetera. So anyway, I think, I've been interested in grappling with like the difficulties and blurry areas because I feel like our human condition really is like that, and that we need to be careful in our language and vocabulary about when we judge anything really, but especially when things are distant from us, either in history or in geography or in
Right.
conceptualization, because it may even be hard to conceptualize the complexity of what's going on in a region.
Yeah, so true. So very, very true. And even the characters, each one of them, at the offset, they were not necessarily happy about it, but then there were other things that came from the movement. And so you never know because you live one life, you go in different directions. You don't really get to know, well, what would have happened if what would have happened if Oscar had stayed in Poland, and even when he reconnects, there's a lot of anti-Semitism in Poland. So maybe it wouldn't have been such a good thing for him. And I'm trying not to give too much away, but even like
Yeah.
Roger, he's the one who's wrestling the most with his, because he's the philosopher in the book. And yet he realizes that, well, I had this whole family I didn't even know about. Like this is a whole different side of me that I wouldn't have known about. Even that book, I don't know if you saw Leopold Shot, but that
Yes.
was, that was where, the author, the playwright realizes that he had stoppered, his whole life he was Jewish. He didn't know. And so all of that stuff came out, well into his 80s when he found that and was able to write it. So I
Yeah.
think I really appreciate, I think we all appreciate the complexity that you do tackle and that you do bring on, because there really is no right or wrong answer. It's just kind of what people made the best decision at the time. And
Yeah.
this is the aftermath, and people have to live with that. And that's really what life is all about.
Yeah.
Making
And I
forward.
think that this sort of basic question of the book, I guess, is something like, how does one reroute after rupture? And in a way, it isn't one answer to that. We reroute and there's just all kinds of complexity to that rerouting. And sometimes we find these great things that come from rerouting, right? Like there is new life in the rerouting. And had you stayed in the other, you might have been in ways withering. It's hard to know.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's really, there's no parallel universe where we get to know. Only maybe imagine or hope or dream of it, but and long for it. I mean, I think longing played a big role too. Longing, for a particular connection or a time or something that seemed simpler or easier. And sometimes that's just a matter of youth. Like it seemed simpler because you were young and it was simpler for you. When you're older and trying to make your way, it's not as simple. And yeah, things like that.
Oh, that's very, very true. I want to just open it up. Is there anyone in the audience who had some questions that you would like to ask, Jennifer? Please put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask the question, raise your hand. So I'd like to just, there's so many things so many interesting things that we're talking about here. So are there any questions that are there? Just one comment that I don't know if you saw, but when you were showing that book, Adara Goldberg had said that it really changed her life and that it was a phenomenal historical text. So maybe we can put that in the chat and people can maybe
I'll show you once again. It's called Dividing Hearts. And she's
Dividing Hearts. So
and this woman, Emuna Nachmani Gafni, she was so generous to me. She read my text. Okay, it was like this. I mailed it. Her friend translated it from English to Hebrew. She gave all these comments. Her friend translated those comments back. And then and we went back and forth on various details to make sure it was historically accurate. And then at the end, I mean, quite a long bit later, I get a photo of the two women cheersing me. They had their little drinks and they were giving a cheers. I should get that photo in my little
you should put that in your
the cutest thing. And they're like cheersing me that like we did it. It's done, in terms of their editing suggestions and sort of historical consultation. But but it was so valuable because of the way she was so immersed in the stories of the operatives and the children, and also, you know, all these organizations that were running, you know, these missions to try to reclaim the children. There were a lot of arguments, and there were philosophical arguments, there were financial arguments, there were all kinds of political arguments. There were religious arguments too, because sometimes there were operatives who wanted the children not to go to Palestine, but to be in these other kind of religious settings in Poland. And then there were just different ideas of where the children should go. And so
And
that
who
was,
ultimately made the decision? Who had the final say on
I
what
mean,
happened?
I think what happened was there were different groups working, and whoever got the children
Like possession is nine
got
tenths of
upset
the
who
law.
they
You
went
got the
with.
children, you got to decide where they
and
were going
and
to go.
and then there was a branch organization, Coordinatia for the Redemption of Jewish Children, that like took some of these. Were mostly though the groups that were ending up to bring them to Palestine, but there were sort of other religious groups that wanted a different outcome. So there were, and there were kind of, I think, debates. It's not that they were only like, if I get them I decide, but it was crazy. I mean, when you read the book, you realize like it was about as Jewish as you can get, because there were
Everybody had
there
a different opinion as to what to
yeah,
do.
10 people, 10 different opinions, you know. But and I'm glad Adara Goldberg is here, because we've been in touch a little bit, so it's nice to have you. Thank you. um yeah, I'm trying to think.
What are you working on now? What's your next project?
Yeah, I'm working on a novel. It's so interesting. I mean, it's about trying to expose the kind of crazy, complex politics of deafness,
Uh,
and wanting that show you, like, be a little bit of a microcosm of our larger political
mhm.
craziness. And
Yeah.
and but what's really interesting, you know, as a writer, you know, you're animating very particular characters, right? Like, these are specific people, but every choice you make, you know, it's a decision that kind of shapes the conversation. So, you know, at first I was going to have, so I decided that, you know, I'm going to write from the point of view of a child who loses her hearing at the age of 9.
Okay.
But that's very different than being born deaf. And you
Sure.
didn't lose something when you're born. My children were born deaf. They didn't lose their hearing. They never had hearing. This
Right.
is how they grew up. And to have someone who loses hearing and is grieving losing hearing, and have their
Mhm.
parents are grieving losing hearing, is a totally different thing than not only just being born deaf like my children, but it's totally different again from being born deaf of deaf parents, where
Sure.
that's just how it all is anyway. And you know, so it's been interesting as a writer, because as I'm trying not to throw the conversation, like, because what's been most important to me is, I feel like, you know, whatever pathway you take when, you know, raising your children should be, you know, a fine pathway. Like, you know, if you decide to sign with your kids in terms of deafness, or if they go an oral route, like whatever, like, I think you should make a decision. It should be open to your family, what makes sense for your family, what's best for the connectivity and intimacy of your family and the child and their opportunities in the world, etc. But it's just, you know, trying to animate each point of view and sort of show all the different kind of nuances of that point of view, and
Sure.
why they feel that view, you know, is the right view, etc. So anyway, I'm in the midst of that delicate operation, and it's going really slowly. So
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
it's very personal. It's also, I mean, it is interesting that there is that divide within the deaf community between the deaf, you know, being part of the signing community, or being part of the cochlear implant community and going the oral route. And it's interesting as an outsider to see that there's that divisiveness about which way to go.
Yeah.
And yeah. Well, are
Yeah,
you
and
part of
it's
the
very much
sign
rooted.
community, or are you part of the
I mean,
cochlear implant?
well, let me just say first, like, that whole, you know, it's rooted in history. It can't be looked at without seeing the history of deaf people who are, you know, when there was no technology, were being forced into oral pathways, or were, you know, there were, you know, issues about reproduction. I mean, you know, there was just like this whole history, right, of
Yeah.
pain and marginalization and
Right.
ostracization and all this other stuff. And so like the views aren't just born from sort of like some need to be politically, raucous or whatever. It's like it's
Yeah,
born
yeah.
from sort of a long history, right? And I mean, in our case, it's one of these particular things. It's like we're hearing parents of deaf children. And so for us, when they were born deaf, it was startling, first of all, and our first for our first with our first child, and it felt like a big loss. It felt like a grieving.
Yeah.
It felt like there's all these things they are not hearing. My first daughter, you go outside, the trickle of the river and the way the leaves are moving in the branches, and all these things we're hearing and think are quite beautiful, and the birds or whatever, and she's not hearing them. I mean, of course, like a capital D deaf person is seeing things in those, they're
Yeah,
having their
yeah.
experience and their perceptual world, and it's as full and rich and beautiful as ours, but you're in your perspective, right? And you're used to what you have, and so what you want for your child. And ultimately our children are wearing hearing technology and they speak, and we also had a signing deaf person come to our house every week for years and years and years so that we would learn sign. But we're not really in a signing world in the sense of
Yeah.
our kids, we're really in a hearing speaking world, but we wanted our children to be able to communicate with any deaf person they met, because they share that experience. And so we were, walking our lines and trying to figure out how to do it, but it's very individual and particular. And everyone's, we're just all doing our best, right? But as I started at the beginning of the program, when I said there were people with all these views about how we should raise our child and with whom they should belong, you know a very long time ago, I wrote an article for the New York Times about how we, how in every culture, a mother births a baby, and that baby inherits the language and culture of the parents, right? If I live in Cambodia, if I live in Guatemala, if I live in Ukraine, this is what happens. The
Yeah.
child learns that language and this culture, and this is how it is, right?
Yeah.
But when you're birthing a deaf baby, suddenly people say like, oh, I think your baby should learn this language, or your baby should be raised in this community, or whatever. Suddenly it's not like just the community of the parent, it's like this view of where the child should go. And it was startling to me. I was like, I want to be connected and bonded. This is my baby, right? Like
Oh,
I
yeah.
I want
Yeah.
to raise her,
I'm the mother. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And it was just the idea of it, that people might think that there's a different thing here. And look, I mean, if our children didn't have any access to sound and we weren't going to become fluent signers, then our children would have been hampered, tremendously with a
Yeah.
lack of
Yeah.
language. But we were born, they were born at a time when they could have access to language, through spoken, through sound. But in any case, it's all just really complex, and the ways in which people have attitudes toward it is complex. But I feel also that in most everything I've read, it's always thrown sort of, there's a political bias. And I'm trying
Yeah.
very hard in this new thing to say, like, what if we wrote a novel where there wasn't a bias, where people, especially hearing people, could just read all the sides and see
Yeah.
all the views and kind of really understand, like, it from all sides without being like pushed in a direction. And
Right.
and I don't know. I mean, I thought that might be helpful for our political situation today, where we're like, how do we get a grip on like all the divisiveness and all the the different universes by kind of in their own silos, kept apart. And
Sure.
yeah.
Well, good. I look forward to reading that. I look forward to reading that book.
I look forward to writing it. No,
That's right. So when
it's,
you write
like
it,
I
then we'll
said, it's
read it, and then
really
we'll come
slow. I
back
can't
together
believe.
and we'll talk about it. So that'll be
Yeah.
great. All
Thanks.
right. So are there any questions? We still have a few minutes left. Anyone have any questions?
Don't be shy.
Yes, please.
Well, I, for one, want to say listening to your conversation, both of you this morning, Jennifer and Lisa, made my heart happy. So thank you for being with us, and thank you for sharing, and thank you for your stories and your insight and your work. I know you mentioned Adara Goldberg. I want to say thank you to Adara and Sarah, our sponsors from the Holocaust Resource Center at Kean University. both of you and just continue to educate us. Hearing new stories is a never end to new stories, and I
Um,
find that fascinating. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today on this hard day. And I want to send everyone love and peace, and keep reading. Keep
yes,
reading. And Jennifer, keep writing.
that's right. You have a lot to say, and it's so interesting. So thank you. Thank you for
Thank
being
you.
with our
Thank you so
Thank
much
community
you,
and
for
sharing.
everyone.
yeah.
Have a wonderful day.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.